During the Aboriginal World War, there were abounding British soldiers who faced the ultimate abuse for aggressive crimes and offences. For those men, they were led to the beheading post, aboard Pale ashore into the arena in the Aboriginal morning, and they were a fresh attempt at dawn. The accuracy of these executions is abundant darker, as abounding of the soldiers accursed and accomplished in this way were in actuality actual young, and some were aloof teenagers who were actual continued way from home, angry a war they had little abstraction about. But on the 10th of December 1916, the Aboriginal commissioned administrator in the British aggressive during the Aboriginal World War was executed. Eric Poole was originally from Canada, but abashed to England, but for abrogation during the acute. Angry of the action of the Somme, he was accomplished by battlefront squad. But what accurately did he do, and what acquired his execution? To abutment our channel, amuse, accomplish, abiding to subscribe. Eric Poole was built in on the 20th of January 1885 in Nova Scotia, Canada. As an adolescent man, he abutting up with the Canadian Army and served in the 63rd Regiment, the Halifax Rifles. But afresh afore the Aboriginal World War bankrupt out, Poole immigrated and abashed to England with his family, and he lived central of the boondocks of Guildford in Surrey. As the Aboriginal World War took authority in Europe, afterward abounding, altered countries and nations declaring war on anniversary other, there was a huge drive in Britain to get soldiers into the army. We've all apparent the acclaimed posters of Lord Kiter pointing saying, "Your country needs you." But abounding bodies abutting the war accomplishment because they saw the abstraction of angry and he adopted war as agitative and about like a holiday. Men acquainted actual appreciative to action for their country, nation, and king. And in the Aboriginal weekend of the war, about 1,000 men an hour were signing up, which was absolutely not enough. In 1916, a law was anesthetized to say that men had to accompany the war accomplishment behindhand of if they capital to or not, and this was accepted as conscription. Later PALS battalions were formed, groups of soldiers who were a company afore the war who would action calm but ultimately die together. Eric Poole voluntarily enlisted Aboriginal in October 1914 in the Burgle of London and active up with the Honourable Arms Company. He was an accomplished soldier and was accustomed to administrator training, and he afresh abutting up with the West Yorkshire Regiment. 12 months after he was beatific to the Western Advanced and the trenches to alter abounding admiral who had been dead in the angry, and in May 1916 he accustomed to Brestons. The absoluteness of the war was bleak. It was not a holiday. Neither was the bearings at any point positive. Trenches were abhorrent, and abhorrent places for soldiers to live. They were waterlogged, abounding of rats, and awful problems such as trenchute arose. The injuries abiding on the battlefield were additionally horrific, and the soldiers had to accord with connected arms barges with shells landing all about them every few minutes. Afterlife was actual abundant on the border for any soldier oral the trenches. Now, on the 7th of July 1916, during the action of the S, the action in which the British aggressive suffered their deadliest day in history. Whilst fighting, Eric Poole was abutting to area a carapace hit and exploded. Earth and mud covered him, burying him in a grave. Now, this bedeviled him mentally, and he suffered abominably with carapace shock, a action today affiliated to PTSD. Poole was abandoned from the advanced band and advised in an acreage hospital. He was afresh ages after absolved, and he was fit to acknowledge his assemblage on the Somme, and he was placed in command of an army of soldiers accurately C aggregation of the 11th West Yorkshire Regiment. But on the 5th of October 1916, during an advance in which his men were to advance to peer adversary trenches at Flers, Poole was boilerplate to be seen. He had gone absent after leave, best apparently apparitional by his carapace shock, and he was absolutely begin abnormality a few canicule after by British aggressive badge who arrested him. On the 24th of November 1916, Poole was brought to a cloister line proceeding in advance of Admiral from the 23rd Division. There were 6 men who gave affirmation about him abrogation from the battlefield, but additionally a brace of aegis, witnesses including a doctor, who claimed that Poole was adversity from a cerebral action so bad that he was absolutely unfit to command soldiers at the time of his arrest. And it was claimed that he should accept been boilerplate abreast the battlefield. Poole additionally declared that at the time back he went AWOL, He had been actual abashed and not in a actual acceptable abode mentally. He additionally claimed he did not apprehend how austere it was for him to carelessness his position and men in column, and how this could in a faculty advance to execution. The admiral, in allegation of the affairs, additionally claimed that Eric Poole had been adversity from a complete afraid collapse at the time in which he larboarded his men, but about he was begin accusable of a aggressive allegation and the breach of abrogation, and with this was absolutely artlessly bedeviled to afterlife by battlefront squad. So the British accursed him, admitting the actuality he was a ailing man. And today let's anticipate of the force of that. The British would agreeably assassinate a man who was mentally ill and adversity with the cerebral furnishings of the ambiance he was placed in. Specifically, it was assured in the cloister martial that he was of complete apperception and able of affectionate the attributes of his actions. This, of course, is actual abundant debatable. The man who had the final say on the beheading of Eric Poole was none added than Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, General Sir Douglas Hay. Hay accepted the adjudication and afterlife sentence. Advertence that it was awful important that all ranks should apprehend that the law is the aforementioned for an administrator, as is a private. So Hay accursed Eric Poole to appealing abundant. Accelerate a bulletin to added admiral in the British Army not to arid from their post. He was larboard central of the aggressive prison, and on the 10th of December 1916, Eric Poole was brought out from his Bastille corpuscle, and he was to be attempt at Aurora abreast to the Boondocks anteroom at Poperinghe in West Flanders in Belgium. The 31-year-old was brought out in advance of admiral to a pail which had been anchored in the ground. Out filed the battlefront squad, the accumulation of British soldiers armed with their rifles whose job it was to accompany Eric Poole's activity to an end. He was attached to the pail, and a blinder apparently was placed about his eyes so he could not see his final seconds. A priest offered absolution before retreating, and afresh the administrator, in allegation of the battlefront band, ordered his men to accession their rifles. They stood there with their weapons acicular at the target, a baby allotment of cardboard which had been affianced to the chest of Eric Poole over his heart. Back the adjustment was given, the soldiers accursed beeline into their target, bringing the activity of the aboriginal administrator in the British Army to be accomplished for aggressive offences to an end. He was one of alone 2 aggressive commissioned admiral during the Aboriginal World War to be accomplished for such aggressive offences such as desertion. Eric Poole's adventure is one which is adverse and terrible, and he was addition who was accomplished admitting the actuality he had been adversity with carapace shock. Today the action is accepted a lot better, and he should never accept been accursed for the abomination of desertion. But there were hundreds added who were accomplished during World War I for these array of aggressive crimes. But actual few of them were absolutely officers, best actuality genitalia, and those bottom baronial soldiers who were accustomed to absolutely tougher sentence. Thanks for watching. To abutment our channel, amuse accomplish abiding to subscribe, and already again, acknowledge you so abundant for watching.